Thanks everyone for being here for this kind of almost afternoon session. And in this session, I'm going to be talking about client-centered data collection. And some of the goals for our session are about how to approach data collection as an interpersonal process, how to incorporate clients' culture as part of our assessment, and how to walk away with, and we're going to make sure you walk away with some examples to facilitate data collection. And I'm someone who's okay being interrupted. I will be able to keep an eye on the chat. Some of the examples I use within this presentation are from our work as an agency that does run the crisis line. So some of the examples are with the assumption that you might have a more brief encounter with someone, but I do think they also apply within longer standing clinical settings. And I do want to start with getting a little bit of audience participation going. And this could be in the chat, or folks can unmute if they're feeling brave, but I do think it's a pretty important piece of talking about data collection to be to kind of start out by maybe simply, what are some topics that you consider to be private? So if people just want to drop in a word in the chat of what do you consider to be private? And I provide this session health information. And I provide this session a couple times a year. So I can give you all some examples of things that usually come up when I provide this session. People talk about kind of money as something that feels private to them. So when we say private, we're not talking about like HIPAA, but we're talking about like in our sensibilities, what might feel private. People talk about their, depending on who they are and how they were raised, their religion feeling like private and personal. Oh, here we go, Joanne, putting religion, marital status. Depending on how safe someone's feeling, their sexual orientation, gender identity might not feel safe to be out. So we all have these different notions of what we consider to be private. And I think it's important, family problems, yes. To be in reflection of where do our notions of what we do and don't talk about come from. And if folks want to keep now answer this question in the chat, where do our notions of what we do and don't come from, you talk about come from? Joanne, I see your mental health issues, and this is so real. This one comes up so often as something that people have been taught not to talk about, depending on people's like family culture. So when I say culture, I don't just mean like race or ethnicity. People have been told we don't talk about stuff outside of our home, right? We don't take our problems outside of our home, and that's really important. Yeah, and our notions, Jessica, thank you, come from family, stigma, past experiences. Past negative experiences with help seeking can really impact someone's openness the next time they're in a room with a helper. And a lot of our notions do come from our culture, from our families of origin, and from our kind of like society. I think our society as a whole has kind of an unspoken, but often pretty explicit list of things that are okay to be spoken about or not okay to be spoken. And as people who might be safety, particularly in regards to systems of oppression, colonial history, for sure. Yeah, there's been people who've, for a sense of their own protection, have had to hide parts of their identity. I'm kind of starting with a bit of self-disclosure. My family are political and religious asylum seekers. And I moved to the US when I was 13, and that really does inform my work and my sensibilities. And one of the things that we were taught as children for our own safety was to not talk about our religious affiliation. And kind of moving into us thinking about ourselves as helpers, what are some dynamics that we might consider as we do an intake or collect any data from a client? And we know that data collection doesn't just occur at intake or assessment phase, but I do kind of lean on that as a time where we're asking a ton of questions, often at an onset of a relationship where there might not be a ton of rapport. So I want us to be in reflection of what are some dynamics in terms of maybe um, power, privilege, and other dynamics in the room that we might want to consider when we are asking questions of our clients and those that we're trying to support. And as someone who's worked in both self-referred programs as well as like anonymous services like the crisis line, but also court mandated services, I want us to be aware of that dynamic as well. Does the person have a choice to be in the room with you? And are you associated with a system that is taking their freedom away and forcing them into treatment? We know that that's a part of our current systems. And the last piece, and I know there's people are kind of reflecting in the chat a bit. If you're comfortable, continue to do so. If not, I hope that you're able to have this like internal process as I'm kind of posing these questions is, can you think of elements that make you as a person more or less comfortable when you are a patient, consumer, or client being asked for information? And I often give the example of, for anyone who might have ever gotten their primary care at Kaiser. And this is no diss to Kaiser, but there's often a computer in the room. And your provider might be looking at their computer while they're asking you rather personal questions about your life, your presenting problem, what brought you in today, what you've tried. And oftentimes that process can feel really unpersonal, impersonal. And it's this moment where you're kind of trying to verbalize something that you might have not spoken to before, but the person you're trying to speak to is typing on their computer. So even our very stance of our physical body, our eye contact and things like that really make a big difference when we are asking folks questions that they might consider to be private. And with that, a few notes about questions. I think as providers and helpers, it's really important for us to be aware of who gets to ask the questions and the power dynamic that that creates within a therapeutic relationship. Here at CSS, some of our clients are older adults. We specifically have an older adult program. And in our older adult program, we might have an intern who is, let's say, in their 20s, working with an older adult who's in their 70s. So with that, there's multiple power dynamics in the room. There is this sense of the age difference between the provider and the help seeker, but there's also the power dynamic of the clinician or the helper really being the person who is seen as the authority in that room. So it's really important for us to be aware of the layers of dynamics that might be present in a situation where we're asking information or questions. So what stage of the relationship is this occurring? As I said earlier, most of our info gathering often occurs at the earlier parts of the therapeutic relationship, or for those of us who provide really short-term services, it might be the only time we're interacting with someone. And it can be hard to ask some of these questions without rapport. So one of my goals today is to help us create context and buy-in within the framework of asking a question as a way to not have the process of asking these questions feel separate from rapport building, but have them be intertwined. And really being aware of the fact that it's not supposed to feel like an interrogation. For a lot of people, being asked many questions in a rapid fire way begins to make them feel like they're in trouble. It's a bit of a principal's office, or even worse, it could feel like a police officer who's like asking a lot of questions. It creates a sense of, am I doing wrong? So we don't want to be losing sight of all of our other counseling skills during a time when we might be assessing and asking a lot of questions. So validation, reflecting of feeling, reflecting of meaning, those things should still be occurring even in the data collection moments of our conversations with clients or help. One of the things that I find begins to level the playing field and mitigate the power imbalances inherent to the help seeker helper relationship is for the helper to understand the why and to be able to articulate the why. So why are we asking for different data points or different information of our help seekers? So for you yourself to understand that also makes it less likely for you to abandon that question or consider it to be too intrusive. So one of my roles in the past has been doing quality assurance at looking at data from programs. And there are some questions that I find people abandon so often, either they mark did not ask or client did not respond. And to me, when that happens over and over again, that's really signaling the discomfort of the provider with that topic more than anything else. So we want to understand the why, because that will help us as providers have buy-in into the question, but it also helps create empowerment for the consumer or help seeker as to why are we asking them. And always try to know the answer of what do you do with this information? We live in a society where people's information can and has been like weaponized against them by systems. So it's really important for us to be able to answer, how do we protect people's information and where is that particular data point going? So sometimes it's, we want to make sure we understand who we're serving. Other times it could be, oh, we actually don't share individual level data, but we do share our program data as a whole with the county. So whatever that answer is, it's important for all the providers at every level of the agency, including the person who answers the phones and is collecting data from first-time callers, to really understand what happens to the information. And this has become a little even, I think, more sticky in recent months, as those providers who have government contracts might be entering data into large government systems outside of our agencies, and having to be transparent about that, in that there are things that could occur that are outside of our control. So being transparent about what happens to someone's data is a way in which we're empowering them to make an informed decision about whether or not they want to share something with us, and being respectful of where they land with that. And understanding that clients may be reluctant to discuss some areas of their life. And one of the areas that might come up, the areas that different people might consider sensitive, do depend on who they are, the identities they hold, and various cultural groups they might belong to. However, asking specific questions and opening the door for certain things to be a natural part of our conversation or our relationship as helper help seeker could give those things permission to come up later within the assessment phase or even later in a conversation. So we don't want to assume that someone doesn't want to talk about something. And I think that's an important piece. Sometimes it's the provider that's assuming the question is too sensitive or too personal and skipping it. And by doing that, they're actually eliminating the opportunity for the client to talk about that topic. So I really want to highlight how not bringing a topic up is often the work of the provider. And another piece of the why and how you might be able to phrase it with a consumer is, these are some of the things that we share with people at CSS when we're trying to collect specific data sets, specifically around demographics, which people can be hesitant to share. We want to talk about how it helps us understand who we're serving. We sometimes share with people that our goal is to have our clinical services focusing on those who would otherwise not be able to access services. So information like income comes into that category. Other times I've shared with folks that our goal is to have our crisis line, text line, and community education services spread across the county. So you providing your zip code really helps with that. And some questions I don't think require us to preface them with these descriptors every time we ask them, but it's important for us to know why we're asking in case the person that we're speaking to says, why do you need to know that? And that's something that comes up in our work, I will say, on the crisis line very, very often, is people wanting to know why a specific point of information is missed. So I'm going to give two examples of crisis-related fields. And I give these examples because I believe that even though the specific wording is specific to the crisis line, these are questions that providers, regardless of the setting, tend to feel ambivalent about asking, or they might feel like this is an awkward question or this comes out of nowhere. So I think some of the ways in which I will present the phrasing could be helpful in other places of assessment and information gathering as well. So one of the questions we ask people on the crisis line is, have they had thoughts of suicide in the last 2 months? And the reason for that is we know that individuals who've had thoughts of suicide in the last 60 days are at a higher risk. And the way we might bring this up, and a lot of our call takers have shared that this is a really awkward thing to ask because it's not in the moment. So the problem is not with the suicidal content, but it's about this like 2-month marker that feels a bit arbitrary and removed. So I might ask someone, you know, a little history could help me better understand what you're going through today. Have you had any thoughts of suicide in the last 2 months? And by that context setting, that half a sentence before it, I might be putting the person, the help seeker, in a bit of a, like, kind of in a more comfortable position. Or I hear that you're thinking about suicide today. To help me get a sense of how things have been for you lately, could you tell me if you've had thoughts of suicide in the last 2 months? And if there's anyone who wants to contribute in the chat, how they might ask questions like this to contribute to our group understanding of the topic, that's always welcome as a part of this presentation, because these are some of the ways that, like, over time, I found it helpful to engage with folks, but I know there's tremendous wisdom in the room as well. The other question that a lot of our counselors find difficult to ask every caller is around the person's intoxication. Are they using substances? And I think substance use didn't come up as something that feels private, but I think in the context of help seeking, people do have guilt and shame around their substance use and might not always be forthcoming if we don't bring it up. So we might ask someone, hey, I'm thinking about your safety as we talk tonight. Are you comfortable telling me if you've been drinking or using any drugs? And we always kind of put it out there together, as opposed to asking them separately. It kind of gives the person an opportunity to disclose at the same time. It also puts them at the same, like, I think drinking is a little less stigmatized, and asking together, I find, helps people disclose a little bit more. If we have a history of the person, we might say, you mentioned drinking when things get bad, like in the past. Is that something you've tried to manage things tonight or recently? Kind of depending on the time frame that you all are. You said sometimes you just want to forget. What do you mean by that? This one's a little more indirect, but for people who we know have a history of substance use, I always ask this question because the answer could take us to substance use. It could also take us to suicidal intent or desire. So it's an example of a clarifying question that reflects the client's, like, statement back to them, but also helps us better understand what they mean by that. And once again, feel free if you have ways that you ask about substance use. And I know others might feel like, oh, I just ask because, you know, we want to get used to asking. But I do find that sometimes people say, like, why do you need to know that? So you might have your own way, but it's helpful to have some backup explanations of if someone is like, why do you need to know that? I'm not even calling about substance use. You could say, you know, like, we are always thinking about safety and substance, like when people sometimes use substances when they're having a hard time, and that will help me understand what things are like for you right now. So really kind of focusing on helping them understand why we want a certain data. Some demographic things that we have come up quite often for us. And once again, I think it's interesting because our service is meant to be anonymous. So we might face additional, I will say, pushback around any kind of questions that we ask folks on the crisis line, whereas people in an in-person setting or outpatient setting might have very different experiences. After this slide, I will open it up for a moment for people to chime in about what they find difficult asking clients, so we can have like a moment of putting me on the spot to come up with ways, or having the whole group work together at brainstorming some of this. So I'm going to share a couple more examples on this slide, and then I do want us to open it up for a moment and see if there's specific fields that you find difficult to ask about, or you find that there is hesitance on the part of your clients or help seekers around, and we can kind of see if we can help contextualize them or make them a little easier to bring up. So age is something that people sometimes don't like to tell us, and it's interesting because I sometimes wonder if the reasoning behind the hesitation is knowing that there could be a mandated report or things like that. So we want to be clear, like, as we think about referrals or as we think about coping skills, it can be helpful for me to know your age. Are you comfortable telling me your age? So having the invitation there, but also sharing the why of um, the question is a way that we try to approach things. Living situation, who someone lives with is something that's really important, especially if you're in an environment where you might be thinking about a safety plan with someone. We know that if someone has a support system where they live, that's really an asset during the safety planning process. But we also don't want to assume that just because they live with someone that there is support in their home. I think that's an important distinction to make. So I ask people, like, there's so much going on. Do you live on your own or do you live with other people? Do you have support where you live? Do the people you live with know what's going on with you? And in our work, working with individuals in crisis, we find that they might have not told anyone in their life about what's going on for them. So we might be asking, um, do you feel like you could talk to these people? And that itself becomes part of our brainstorming and safety planning, is identifying whether any of these individuals could be an ally to this person if, let's say, they wake up at 2 a.m. with an urge to harm themselves. Another thing that comes up for us is zip code. Um, for zip code, we ask things like, we might say things like, we want to make sure we're serving everyone in the county. Do you mind sharing your zip code? So like kind of this broader perspective. We want to better understand where our callers are from, or we've been talking about referrals, like knowing what city you live in would be really helpful in giving you a referral that's close to you. So the zip code might once again feel really unique to running an anonymous service like the crisis line. But I do think it's important to keep in mind that we do have consumers that don't want us to know where they live, or consumers who don't have a consistent place that they live. So if you're working with someone in a more long-term way and you know there's some instability in their housing, whenever you're talking about referrals, it's always important to ask, where are you staying at right now? And that makes room for them to also disclose to you that, like, oh yeah, the place I was staying at didn't work out. I'm in my car right now, or I'm staying at a friend's. So whenever we are in a place to be trying to connect people to the next thing or to basic needs and things like that, it's really important to acknowledge that the information we have might be outdated at this point. So making room for people to disclose some of the instability in their situation through asking where they're staying at. I'm going to pause for a second and ask if there's any questions or areas of data collection that any of you find difficult asking about, or yeah, so you can put it into chat or you can raise your hand. For anyone here who's a prevention provider, I know the statewide prevention data collection sheet includes both gender at birth, or sex assigned at birth, and then gender identity. And that's something that some of our staff and interns have shared within the context of providing services that can be hard. They feel like it's hard to ask, and that not everyone kind of is familiar with that vocabulary. So I think that's another one that it's helpful um, to share, like why we're asking, or give examples, or if there's a possibility for there to be a multiple choice instead of like a verbal response, that could help people have a sense of, by seeing the options, they might be better equipped to answer, because they might find that, oh, like that's how they identify. So I know that's a question that some of our prevention partners have brought up as being challenging depending on the setting. And there's been lots of conversations statewide about at what age do we begin to ask those questions of help seekers and consumers. I see two things in the chat. One is we've had some staff struggle with asking about sexual orientation, gender identity, and pronouns. Yeah, so that definitely goes along with what I was just sharing. And an example can sometimes be helpful for people who might not be familiar with that. So we could say, like, if I was talking about you, how would you like me to refer to you? Would you like me to refer to you as she, he, they, or something else? So as opposed to being like, what pronouns do you use? That kind of trips people up who might not live or work in spaces where that's a common way of like exchanging information. So having that example and like having that come from a place of respect, which is if I was talking about you. Yeah, and around gender identity and sexual orientation, this is interesting. These are two that like often are written on forms and not verbally asked. And I find that they become clunkier when they become verbal ones. But one of the ways that like I think about it is in my head thinking about the benefit to those who feel seen as a result of us asking this question outweighs the number of times it feels awkward or clunky. And that's a way that we can kind of like remind ourselves of why we're asking the question. And we always say like we want to know the whole person that we're serving, or we want to make sure our program is inclusive, and that's why we ask these questions. So those two can be helpful in helping the other person not feel like, what does this have to do anything with what we're doing, or this feels too personal. And the reality is they always have the option of not sharing. And like, so if they're kind of stuck or being like, it seems like today is not the right day to talk about this, and that's okay too, you know. Um, I'm gonna go to the next comment in the chat from Hazel. Thinking about asking about recent experiences someone has had. Sometimes the 2-month marker gets difficult for people to recall how far back that is, but having common general benchmarks can be helpful. Since school started, since the Thanksgiving holiday, definitely. I actually would double down on this if you work with young people. Like they might have a harder, or older people, really anyone actually could have a hard time, but it is really helpful having those markers. Or if someone's like struggling with a timeline, connected to what Hazel mentioned, being like, well, can you remember when that was about? Was that before you started seeing me or after? Was that before you moved or after? So like using other markers to help the person like locate the experience is really helpful. I appreciate that. We have Monica saying, on the other side of that, sometimes the person answering the question gets defensive about being asked. Any de-escalation tips? I would immediately acknowledge the fact that the question, like, they didn't like it. So being like, I can tell that question felt like, depending on kind of what they're emoting. So like, are they angry, or are they saying like, that's none of your business? So like, I can tell that question felt too personal, or I can feel like that question, that it might not feel like the right time for that question. So like, I'll walk it back in the moment if the person is having a big reaction to it. And I'm someone who, like, from a therapeutic standpoint, is a behavior therapist. So I believe like behavior is communication. So for me, I'm also noting in my mind when it was or what question it was that the person had that big reaction to. Because if this is someone that I'm going to be working with on an ongoing way, I'm actually making a mental note to come back to that particular topic from a different angle in the future, because it seems to hold a lot of charge. But I wouldn't further go at it right now. And someone who might be escalated during a information collecting stage might not be a good person to try to process that within the moment. But if you are about to have an ongoing relationship with that person at another interaction, it is appropriate to say, I remember the last time we approached this topic, you had a really big reaction, either like you got angry or got upset, however I would verbalize that. Like, is today a good day for you to try and help me understand, like, what was it about the question that felt hard? So using, like, I would use a more neutral word like hard, as a way to, and because like something that's hard could still be done, as opposed to closing the door on that question long term. Yeah, so, but I do think it becomes really disincentivizing when someone has a big reaction to one of your questions, because A, now it's making you question like all the other things you wanted to ask and whether they're going to get a similar reaction. So it can be really discouraging to be in needing to gather information or be in the assessment phase when someone is having big reactions. I will say the question that on the crisis line, I don't know whether or not people would be surprised, results in quite a bit of defensiveness or big feelings sometimes, is asking folks if they're feeling suicidal today. We definitely have callers who really don't like being asked that question. And they say, why do you ask me that? And we just kind of try to root that in our service model and our values, being like, one of the reasons we're here is to help people stay safe. And this question is really important. So that's another way to not meet them where they're at, especially if it's a question like suicide safety, which is a really important part of our service delivery, is helping them understand kind of where you're coming from. So intention. So we've talked about context already, but intention can also help kind of de-escalate the situation. Depending on the degree of escalation, the info gathering might need to stop, of course. Like usually I'll try to like throw a softball out next to see if the person can move past it. But if they remain elevated, then we're really kind of focusing on, it seems like we've had enough for today, if that's a luxury you have. And I know we don't have that luxury in all of our programs to really pause the info gathering for the session or for the interaction. But if that's possible and the person isn't able to like switch gears, I would try to take them somewhere else. And one of the ways I see this is like the big emotions are kind of part of someone kind of responding, and they're like brainstem response. So I will try and ask a question to bring them to their prefrontal cortex. So either asking like a storytelling question or a date and time question. Basically, I'm trying to change their presentation through getting them to recall something as a way to change the way they're responding to the prior question. So I might be like, let's take a break. Like, how'd you get here today? Or what are you planning on doing after this? So like kind of trying to get them to disclose something else as a way to get the escalation to reduce. All right, I'm going to pop to my next slide, but please do feel free to continue and enter things in the chat. The next piece is some of the cultural formulation questions that I want to bring up. And the cultural formulation questionnaires are something that are included at the back end of the DSM. And at the end of the presentation, I do have links to like the full length versions of them. But for the purpose of my presentation, I have selected some of them and highlighted them to bring up as ones that help us introduce the concept of culture into assessment and information gathering, but they could be used at any phase of either treatment or your relationship with a help seeker, regardless of your role. I want us to be in holding that culture as part of every interaction, whether or not we put it in the room. And that's why it's really important for helpers to have specific language that helps them introduce it, so that they're not shying away from acknowledging its existence. And the goal of specifically the questions that I've highlighted is creating space for the client's own understanding and problem, as well as their ideas about help seeking. So it really helps us better understand how does the client or help seeker understand the issue, and what do they think about the fact that they've called us today or that they've reached out to us for help. And it allows for conversation between the clinician-client relationship, but this goes beyond that. This also applies to any other help seeker relationship. And it is not only when the helper and the help seeker are from different cultures. And this feels really important. This is something that we have talked about with our intern group, with folks at CSS before, which is sometimes actually when we have a perception that we share many identities with a help seeker, we might be in bigger problem because we might be making assumptions. So for me, like I shared at the onset of this training, that my family moved here when I was a teenager. But that doesn't mean that I have the same like immigration story or experience as someone else who might have done so. And that could even be true if you are from the exact same country, exact same region as someone else. Still, don't make assumptions about what the other person's experience of the world or their current challenges is. Even though I think it could feel comforting in the moment to jump. So the purple ones are the ones I'm going to highlight, but I did include some of the other ones that I liked here. And once again, the list to the full questionnaires are at the end of the presentation. So one of the ones I like because it allows for things to come up regardless of the depth of the relationship with someone is, sometimes people have different ways of describing their problem to their family or community. How would you describe your problem to them? And that helps me kind of understand the framework within which their problem might be understood within the context of their relationships, especially familiar or community relationships. Another one, and this one's probably my favorite, is, are there any aspects of your background or identity that makes a difference to your problem? And this is an interesting one. And I bring it up because in clinical work, for example, let's say we know that a client identifies as bisexual. We don't want to make an assumption that that bisexual identity has anything to do with their reason that they're help seeking. Same goes with, we know that a client might be disabled. That identity does not necessarily have anything to do with the reason they're help seeking. So same goes for like ethnic and racial identities. So I like asking people, is there any part of who you are, any identities that you hold that make a difference to why you're here or why you're asking for help? Because it allows them to show us where their identities might be interacting with the problem. So in terms of like folks who call the crisis line, that might look like someone saying like, well, I used to belong to X and Y group, but now I don't feel like I can go there because of this. So now in my mind, I'm holding that they have lost the community as a result of an identity, which is kind of adding to their problem, presenting problems. So I will say this is one of my favorite ways to bring identity and background into the room, even if you're only having a 10-minute interaction with someone. It really can open the door to someone feeling seen. And then, has the problem affected, and obviously like don't just say problem, but like it depends on what's presenting itself, affected your ability to do things you need to do each day. And this is another way that for people who might have been in the field longer, we used to assess people's functioning and give them a functioning score. And that was really based on a very like white centric understanding of functioning, or how someone, what are the tasks that someone needs to complete in order to be seen as a functioning individual. And the field has moved away from that. But I think this is a way to understand how much the problem is impacting someone's ability to live their life. And this is a way to introduce that and to try and understand the degree of impact it's having on them. And do your friends, family, other people in your life treat you differently because of the problem? And this is where someone might say, well, actually, I haven't told anyone. Like, are you thinking they might treat you differently? Or they might say, well, these two people are the only ones who are like nice about it, but my mom pretends it's not happening, and my cousin doesn't believe in mental health challenges. So this is a moment where one question can get us a bit of context for how does this person's experience of their world being impacted by their presenting problem, which is often either in our work, either a mental health or substance use problem. The question about discrimination, have you experienced discrimination or been treated badly as a result of your background or identity, or because of your background or identity? And the questions here are written in the actual official cultural formulation questionnaire, but I do think they all could use a little being a little less rigid. But I do think this is a really important one when I think about the calls we were receiving to the crisis line following the murder of George Floyd, and how we were getting callers whose trigger for reaching out for help and whose trigger for being in a state of crisis was witnessing the murder of someone who looks like them on television. I think it's really important to not only save this kind of thing for when we have a well-known thing, but acknowledge that there are many communities, including communities of color, LGBTQ folks, who are on a daily basis being exposed to violence against people who hold those identities, and that does impact people's well-being and mental health. So asking a question about if discrimination or being treated, have they ever been discriminated against or treated poorly because of one of their identities, is a way to assess whether the person is being impacted by those things. And once again, how safe they feel within their contents. In terms of background, how do you usually describe yourself to people outside of your community? This is kind of an interesting, I think, way to get at things like ethnic and racial background. And what are the most important aspects of your background and identity in relation to the problem? So this one is similar to, are there any aspect of your background and identity that make a difference to your problem? This one says, see, what are the most important aspects of your background and identity in relation to the problem? I think either or will kind of get you there in helping understand, is there an intersection between some of the person's identities and what they're experiencing? And this other one I have in here, because we do work with the aging population as one of our primary focus points. And because the folks who we have in those roles are often clinical interns who tend to be younger, I always joke that the age is in the room. So if you're not bringing it up, it doesn't make it disappear. And so it's really important for the clinician to bring that up. So how does being older impact this problem is a way of asking if the person's like identity as an aging adult is part of the way the problem is showing. I have some specific questions that I also want to pull out as it relates to migration. Once again, I'm only going to review the ones that are in purple. And this is important, but there's other ones as well, because often I don't want to say this. When it comes to migration, often there is a very limited portion of someone's experience that's allowed to exist like publicly. And what I mean by that is when people migrate to the United States, they're expected to be grateful to have come here, to now be able to live here. And there's very little room for the grief associated for migration you might be able to talk to other people who share that identity, but in general, there's very little work. There's very little room for that. And I have a former colleague of mine whose work now is dedicated to acknowledging the grief and loss of migration and how that impacts people. And thinking about grief and loss, we're thinking about grief of a place, a people, but it could be grief around rituals and even grief of belonging, grief of language. So really wanting to have a couple questions that begin to introduce to the other person that we are able to hold space for the complexity of their experience with migration is really important. So I think very simply asking people, how has your life changed since coming here? What do you miss about the place or community you came from? I think this is a very gentle way to make room for there to be grief as part of the experience. And even people who, and I'll use like my family's experience, even people who immigrated here because truly like they were in danger, and this is a place where we do live in a more safe environment, there is still grief of a homeland, of a family that was left behind. And I will say, as someone who's been in enough therapy and has been a therapist, I don't think anyone has ever really created space for that explicitly within those relationships. Um, and is there anything about your migration experience or current status in this country that makes a difference to your problem? And this is a way to make room for people to share about their documentation status if they haven't already, because we know that that could be tremendously stressful. I provided a training for a group of immigration attorneys once because they had reached out to me because when they disclosed to a client that their application had been rejected, they had had enough clients disclose like suicidal thoughts to them, and they wanted to know kind of like how to approach that. So the thinking about individuals who are here with uncertain status, who are awaiting a status change and things like that, we really want to be able to hold room for the complexity of that experience and allow it to be expressed as part of their relationship with us as a helper. And this next question only applies if you are kind of continuing to go down this path, is making room for them to share with you of the people close to them who stayed behind. There can be quite a bit of survivor's guilt for people who have had to split the family. I know within school settings, I've worked with children who were one of, like, the parent was able to immigrate here with only one of their children, and they were the child who got to come here. So they know for a fact that they have siblings left behind in their home country. And in cases where I've interacted with those individuals, there's been tremendous survivor's guilt and also tremendous hardship, because moving here is not easy. So they feel guilty, but also life is hard, and they miss their siblings. This kind of nicely transitions us to some of the ways in which this can be brought up with school-age children, because some of the verbiage of some of the previous questions might feel less, I don't know, friendly to younger kids. So some of the ways to get younger kids to talk about their context and how they feel like they are within their community is, do you feel like you're like other children your age? Or are there ways in which you feel different from other kids your age? And this is and if they do disclose being different, does feeling different happen more at home, school, or where? And this is interesting, especially for young people who might have an identity that they're not out with. So let's imagine a young person who holds an LGBTQ identity that they are out with at school, but not at home, or a person who has a pretty significant caregiver responsibility at home, which is unlike any of their peers, or a young person who is the primary caregiver of people at their home. So we really want to make room for them to be in reflection of the settings in which they might feel like they're different from other people their age. And this is a way to kind of get a better sense of which of their identities might be causing them distress at this time. And for and also, and if you're working with someone, a young person, a nice way to build rapport and really make room for who they are in the room is asking them if their name has any special meaning to them, their family, their community. There's a check-in that we do on the first day of our intern orientation where we ask people to tell us the story of their name. And it's a way for us to really make room for who they are within our space at CSS. And this next slide is around some questions specific to older adults. And just to give you all a heads up, I am coming to the end of my slide. So begin to think about if there are other questions or comments that you want to bring to the larger group today. When it comes to older adults, is there anything about your age that helps you cope with your current life situation? So don't make an assumption that someone being an older adult is necessarily a hindrance. What was interesting actually at the onset of the pandemic is there was this tremendous worry about older adults and isolation. And it was very real because older adults were having to keep themselves physically isolated more than others. But one of the kind of things that I think surprised people was older adults ended up being more resilient, and their mental health was in the initial first year. And things have changed since, obviously, the pandemic kind of went on to have many stages. In the first year, their mental health was actually less impacted than youth and younger adults. And one of the kind of theories around that was the ability for older adults to hold perspective, and for there to have been more likely for them to have overcome other challenges in their lives where they can kind of tap into their own resilience, and be able to get through a hard thing because they've gotten through hard things before. So that was an interesting thing. And it's kind of a reminder to not only assume that the person might be experiencing hardship as a result of their aging identity. Um, if there's a significant age difference between the provider and the client, do you think that the difference in our ages will influence our work in any way? So putting that in the room and letting there be an option for the person to speak to it, while understanding that we won't always have like an alternative for them, but at the very least, I think making space for that often tends to reduce its power in the room. And these are questions that um, kind of help having the person reflect on the clinician client relationship. It includes like simple things like asking people about their past experiences with help seeking, as well as difficulties with help seeking in the past. But also, I think if there are major differences in identities, naming that sometimes those can make it difficult for clients and help seekers to understand each other, and asking the client if they have any worries about that. And I think it's really important within the context of community mental health to not assume that the person knows what to expect from treatment or has any past experiences. So asking is important, but also if they say like, no, I haven't done this before, really asking like, what do you imagine it's going to be like? Because acknowledging the other person's like anxiety around help seeking is a really helpful way of reducing it, and becomes a really important tool in rapport building and the ability for us to have a better sense of the problem and who the person is. And these ones are reflection questions. These are questions to use in supervision. If you're someone who's in a position to supervise other helpers, or you yourself as a helper could bring these up or reflect on these as a way to identify areas that you can use more support in. Um, so the first question here is like very formal. It asks, how do you feel about your relationship with the client? Did cultural similarities or differences influence your relationship, in what way? A kind of more informal way that I might even bring this into the supervision relationship, I always ask people who their favorite and least favorite client was last week. And that's a way, and it's not just to be funny, but then I say like, what do you think it was about that client that made you feel like more connected to them? Or what do you think about that client that made it feel really difficult? And that begins to help us notice any patterns or notice any kinds of identities or presentations that the supervisee might be having challenges with. So you all find your own way to ask this, but I do think it's important for us to notice who are the clients that we feel drawn to and who are the clients that we hope will cancel, because there's information in that. And I don't think that gets like acknowledged sufficiently in our field, that there's not always this immediate match, and the help giver might have to work through some of their own reactions to the client. And number 5 here says, did the clinical encounter confirm or call into question any of your prior ideas about someone who has those, holds those identities? So I think that's an important way to really encourage people to be in reflection of how our identities bump up against each other when we are helpers and help seekers. And are there any aspects of your own identity that may influence your attitudes towards this client? And on the first day of our volunteer training, with folks who are going to go on, maybe it's not the first day, but at early stages who are going to go on to answer the crisis lines, we do ask people what are their personal beliefs about individuals who might be considering suicide, individuals who die by suicide, as a way to make room for there to be a conversation about how our beliefs impact our ability to be helpful to others. And I think this is an ongoing process that is in support of our clients, is for us to be in reflection of in what ways do our beliefs impact the way we're showing up for different people. Questions, and then we're going to send these out, but this is kind of where you can see the full questionnaire, but the supplementary modules are things like older adults, school age, immigration. I had pulled very few questions out of each of them, but each module does contain a number of questions that it's helpful for people to look through and determine, are any of these questions worth adding to your formal assessment and intake process, as a way to ensure that everyone who comes across your program is having an opportunity to reflect on something about their identities as it relates to the problem, as we've been referring to. So I'm going to stop the share, and I see there's a comment in the chat in response to the someone who might be escalated as part of our intake process, and Mariah is sharing about I think it's helpful to let them know that the space is safe, briefly acknowledge that cultural identity is an important strength we want to honor in the interpersonal space of the interaction. I often find labeling and acknowledging the negative impact of systems, borders, immigration, legal, gets people to open up and feel safe. Definitely. And Kelsey's asking if slides will be available. Yes, all slides and recordings will be posted on the conference website, probably by the end of today, if not by end of Monday. And we will send an email out kind of giving you all a link to that, so you can continue to access it. Any questions or comments? Are there any ways that you introduce these topics in your own work that you want to share with us?
I had a question.
Go ahead.
I've had a few chats begin, one a couple days ago. I'm a Christian. Do you believe in anything? And very direct questions.
Yeah.
And what is your best advice on best practices around judicious self-disclosure when we're asked very direct questions like that? Especially questions where they're not just asking, are you a blank? They're asking, do you believe in anything at all? And it's kind of, it feels like saying either yes or no is both the wrong move.
Definitely. And you start by saying these are chats. So these are also people for whom you have no context of,
Right.
you know, and so, and I'll share kind of what I recommend, and other people can chime in too. In those kinds of contexts, I'm most likely to say, I can tell that your Christian identity is really important to you, you know, like validating why they're bringing it up. And like, I don't share within a text or chat setting like that my own religious or spiritual identity, because I agree with you, David, that I don't think there's necessarily a right, like, I don't think it actually helps the texter, basically, because their understanding of what a believer is might be very different from yours. And so just being like, yes, I don't think we'll get you anywhere, but being like, I can tell this is really important to you. Is that what you would like to talk about today? So I would like kind of go into that. Or I would say, does being a Christian impact like how you're feeling? Or so kind of include being a Christian in my initial response as a way to validate its importance, but I wouldn't come out and say yes or no to that. Because one of the things I tell people, especially around like chat, text, crisis line, is we're trying to build rapport with a system as opposed to with an individual. Like, I want this person to be able to call us back or call you back and get help again. And let's say today, the two of you really connect on your shared spiritual journeys. What is that going to leave the person if they need help tomorrow and the person on shift doesn't share that with them? So in times when we're like doing these really time limited anonymous interventions, it feels almost harmful to over rely on like personal connection, because it could become a barrier to the person's help seeking next time. Yeah. And if they fall off, like, because they don't want to talk to you because you don't answer the question, I would just validate, like, like, it feels like you can't trust me because I'm not answering that question. But I hope you would consider telling me what brought you to the chat line today or whatever that is. So even acknowledging if they do go silent after your non-response, that like, yeah, I didn't answer, but like, would you be down to still tell me what's going on? Just as opposed to pretending you're not ignoring the question, acknowledging that you're ignoring the question, I do think kind of makes it a little more possible to move beyond it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if any of our colleagues want to put their approach to very pointed questions like that in the chat, let me know. However, I do self-disclose around things like age or parental status, which are also things that I find come up. I think that the reason I differentiate is that they seem to be a little more like inconsequential, or like, someone says like how old you are, I'll be like, oh, I'm in my 40s or I'm in my 30s. Like, I just, I don't think that's as pointed as asking someone, are you a believer? And it often doesn't impact rapport in the same way, or it doesn't impact their future helps. Or like, are you a parent? We answered phone after hours for a parenting stress line. Is like, I am, but I want to hear about your experience as a parent. Or I'm not, but I want to know what parenting's been like for you today that made you call us. Any other questions from the group or comments? I'll let the silence linger for another minute before I close this out.
I mean, I do have one other question.
Go for it.
Sorry.
No.
I thought you gave some excellent examples of how to weave demographic gathering into the conversation itself. And something that has come up in our and some other organizations that I've interacted with is there is increased momentum, I'm avoiding the word pressure, from our partners for more demographic gathering.
Yeah.
And that, what about when categories that entities would like to know about, like age, parenting status, military status, gender identity, race and ethnic identity, etc., those things don't come up. But the conversation went very well. What is your thought on bringing up an explicit survey-like demographic gathering conversation at the end of this conversation that went very well, where I know someone who works at a different hotline who said that they will actually say, do you mind if I ask you some demographic questions so that we can secure future funding, which I hate.
Oof. Yeah.
I'm keeping that anecdote super anonymous, but I understand.
I know.
And
I know.
they
I do
only whip
too.
it out when the conversation went very well.
Yeah.
And they get a lot of information apparently.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about asking a bunch of questions when it really is, it just hasn't come up, but you sense they probably would answer the questions because you have good rapport. And
Yeah.
you'd like to know.
I would bring it up, and I would
How do you
actually, like, similarly, I would say something like, I'm more of a, like, we're trying to better understand who's using our services kind of person, because that's true for me. Like, I am constantly looking at the limited demographic data that we do collect on the crisis line to find gaps in our, like, there's entire parts of the county who never call us. There is certain age groups because it helps with our outreach, right? So I like to say, like, hey, we're trying to better understand who's using our service. Is it okay if I ask you a couple demographic questions? And being like, it's okay if you want to skip any of them. and then going back to back. And I think this is the exception to, at the beginning, I was like, try and not ask like a bunch of questions back to back, is when you've given the person kind of the heads up that like, I'm about to ask you a couple questions back to back, because then like, and they're straight up demographic, there's no need to stop and like reflect or do anything in between. You can be like, age, zip code, city, gender, veteran status, and they can give you answers. And in reality, it does make our services better when we understand who it works for and who is using it. And if someone asks you, how do you use it? Being like, we do share the aggregate information with our funders because they're also trying to understand who's using the service. Or we do use the total information, because like aggregate is so jargony. We do use the total information, but not your individual information. So that's kind of how I bring that up when we do demographic collection. And I do agree there's quite a bit of pressure to know more about who's using prevention services. And it makes it hard for these one-off interactions to include that much data gathering. Cool. All right, everyone. I put the eval in the chat. If you don't mind taking a moment to fill that out for us, especially if you want to see you, then you definitely got to fill it out. I will hover here if anyone has anything else, but with that, our session's ending, and we really appreciate you attending the 988 conference today. And we hope to see you at our events or learning opportunities in the future. Take care, everyone.